So, a friend of mine the other day was angry at God. It's a fairly common occurrence for him. And we got into a discussion and we got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking about it. The truth is, sometimes the way God deals with us seems inscrutable, or it seems puzzling, or it's odd, or even downright cruel. So, we might be tempted to say that God is just capricious and he does what he wants with us just because he can. Or, maybe it's God's cosmic way of saying something like my dad used to say, which is rule number one, the boss is always right. Rule number two, when the boss is wrong, see rule number one. Now, about 2,700 years ago, give or take a decade or two, Isaiah quoted God as saying, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." That's Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. What I don't think this means is that God is just smarter than us. I think it means God's consciousness is different than ours by orders of magnitude we can't even comprehend. For one thing, God is always present. This is hard for us because we deal with time as a sequential phenomena. We have a beginning, a journey, and an end. We think about that journey, where we want to go, how we should get there, and how it will end. But we go through it one day at a time, regardless. We never know what a day might bring. God, on the other hand, sees our beginning, our journey, and our end, plus everyone we know, plus everyone there is, whoever was and ever will be, all the way to the unfolding of 100 billion galaxies, all in the present. God is outside of time. Chuck Missler once explained it this way. It's a simple analogy, but it's even simplistic, but it's good. It's like we're all in a parade, which starts at one place, and we go along the parade route step by step, waving to onlookers and those next to us. That's how we participate. It's from a single point of view. The way God sees this parade, it's as if he was in a helicopter far above the parade route. He sees everything about it, all the participants, all the floats, all the spectators, etc., all at the same time. And not just a snapshot, mind you. Rather, he sees everything that led up to the parade for everyone in it, the entire parade, and where they'll end up after the parade. He sees it holistically, not sequentially. Now, take this weak analogy, multiply it times infinity, and you'll barely get a glimpse of God's perspective on things. Not our thoughts, not our ways at all. I was talking with a friend of mine recently. I mentioned him at the beginning. He was very discouraged. He was looking back on his career, which, at least from his perspective, peaked 20 years earlier, ending with a very severe illness that lasted nearly a decade. About a year ago, he started a new business, the impetus for which he felt, God inspired him. God said, you need to do this. He felt God was telling him to do it. Yet thus far, it seems to be a total failure. Sales are non-existent, and to cut to the chase, he gets violently angry at God. It occurred to me that there was a similarity worth pointing out about Moses' preparation for his ministry of leading the Jews. And by the time Moses was 40, he had attained the zenith of worldly success. He was the Prince of Egypt. He could have been Pharaoh. Of course, that's not how the story turned out. But there's one aspect that really got my attention. Moses went from the peak of worldly power to humble obscurity in the badlands of Midian tending sheep. It was a drastically steep decline. And kind of similar to what my friend went through. You get a peak of his career, and then all of a sudden, boom, just devastated. But apparently, it was necessary to build the experience and character Moses would need to lead the Israelites. It took 40 years for Moses to become the transformed man that God could entrust with the role of deliverer and his lawgiver for the Jewish people. Why I brought this to my friend's attention was to get a window into how God prepares us for what he wants from us, and how long that sometimes takes, and how difficult and even unpleasant it can be. My friend is in the throes of what for him is a very confusing and troubling time. He's questioning God and what God wants from him. But this is because things just aren't going the way he thinks they should. Now, the Bible implies that Moses had an inkling that he would be Israel's deliverer. Perhaps that's why he took it into his own hands to kill the taskmaster who was abusing a Hebrew slave. The Bible isn't definite on that point, but it's not unreasonable that he would have a sense that God wanted to use him in a particular way. So, given that, how strange those 40 years in the desert must have seemed to him. Where seemingly nothing of any importance happening, no prospects, no opportunities, nothing, just the constant bleating of sheep and a nomadic life in the dust and desolation of the Sinai desert. Of course, Moses' intimate knowledge of the geography of that region, garnered over decades, was, to say the least, extensive. It's hard to imagine him being as effective as he was without this unique and very specific knowledge. Moses knew the desert better than anyone. My friend was experiencing a version of this in his business. A year ago, he produced some videos which he felt he was being directed by God to do. After a year, nothing has happened. The videos haven't sold, and he's questioning what's going on, at times to the point of despair. It's a fair question, though. What's going on? Now, I can't say that I know. But the point I wanted to make with him was that sometimes when God gives us something to do, he has to prepare us from the inside out. Sometimes the stretching and growth doesn't look like anything like we think it should. Now, I can't imagine Moses thinking, wow, this is great. I'm preparing to be the great deliverer of the Israelites while tending sheep for my father-in-law. Right. I can only imagine there were days when he despaired of whether God cared about him or if he'd ever amount to anything, or if there even was a God at all. I'm sure that when God called Moses as a man in his 80s, his confidence was greatly diminished. So when God talked to him, he demurred. The Bible shares this debate. It's almost funny. And it ends up in Exodus 4:13 where he says, "O Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." Which is like, I don't want to do this. I don't like the way this is going. I'm just trying to get out of it. The point that I wanted to make with my friend was that God's way of preparing a person for God-directed work doesn't look anything at all like man's way of preparing himself for a career. In fact, sometimes it appears to be going in the absolute opposite direction. God molds men very differently than men would choose to mold themselves. And part of this understanding was revealed in the passage I shared with him where Jesus says, and it's in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now, he liked this verse, but he confessed that it was somewhat incomprehensible to him. I told him God himself is your rest. I'll say that again. God himself is your rest. Not what God gives you, but the real presence of God himself. I have to put this in a little bit wider context. Since he started his project, he's been planning vacations, which, due to two unexpected injuries, got postponed. Again and again and yet again. The most recent deferment is owing to the current coronavirus crisis. Now, vacations are very important to him. Moreover, he's dealing with symptoms of physical, emotional, and mental burnout. Given that mindset, I suspect that when he hears God will give him rest, that means he's going to get a great vacation. That's his idea of rest right now. Now, vacations are good things. I'm not saying they're not. And they're necessary. The difference is the rest that Jesus is talking about isn't necessarily physical, although it can have physical components. It's about resting in a relationship that prepares you and empowers you to deal with whatever life presents. Resting in God is about finding your resilience, not in the vacation, not in therapy, not in things of any kind, not even in spiritual practices, but directly in Him, in God Himself. When Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden," I don't think He means I'll buy you a vacation or a better bed or I'll make your life easier or anything along those lines. He said, I will give you rest. He goes on to define the nature of that rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The structure of the language in Greek gives us a clue. The word anapaeo is translated as rest. In the active voice, which Matthew uses, it doesn't mean to stop activity. The sense is to refresh someone's soul. So in the next two verses, he expands on the nature of this rest. A yoke in Jesus' day, and in the part of the world that part of the world was typically a wooden beam between a pair of oxen or other animals to enable them to pull together. When we take Jesus' yoke upon us, we partner with him. That is what he means when he says, learn from me. The learning happens as we do life together. In so doing, he tells us we'll find rest for our souls. Now, his listeners understood the soul to mean the mind, heart, and spirit. So he wasn't so much talking about physical fatigue. He was talking more about the worries, cares, and stresses of life. He gives us rest from these burdens. He gives us what Paul talks about in Philippians, the peace of God which surpasses all understanding. Now, Paul gets at this in the epistle when he says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That's Philippians 4:7. What he's not saying is to deny that the issues of life can be tragic, painful, and undesirable, because that's simply untruthful. And it's the truth that sets us free. The temptation here is to strive for an explanation and assign blame. What that does is short-circuit the capacity to deal with what's actually in front of us, in spirit and in truth, and in what I would like to say in acceptance. What we tend to try to do is to understand it so that we can feel better about it. This amounts to trying to control it, and mostly those kinds of efforts fail. What Paul is saying and what God offers is the real presence of peace, or serenity if you prefer. Ironically, we think we'll get this relief if we understand what happened, if we can blame someone, find a solution, or control it. Paul is asserting that serenity, which is available to us in God's kingdom, is greater than that kind of understanding. It surpasses the value of insight and positions us in a spiritual state which is above the problem. But it's not something we gin up on our own steam. It's something we enter into. The journey to admitting that peace begins with deciding, it's a decision, to accept things as they are and head on from that physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual location. To slightly misquote the Borg directive from the Star Trek, it's resistance is futile. And if you do resist, you will be assimilated by your problems. The refusal to accept life on life's terms usually doesn't end well. The peace happens when we're with him, when we're yoked to him. Being yoked doesn't mean you ask God for rest and he gives it to you and then you go your way. No. He goes with you. He remains with you, and you move together in tandem. Picture it for a minute. Two oxen yoked together need to be in step with each other. They must cooperate and move together. One of them just can't go any other way they please, which is, of course, what we try to do. We want to do what we want to do. We get rest from God because he is the very presence of the rest our souls so desire. So God's presence is the location of our rest. Now, I want to say to my friend and anybody else who feels pressure to get some time off, that's necessary too. We all need to detach from our lives and difficulties and challenges sometimes, just to get perspective. Jesus did that. He went off by himself to reconnect with the Father. There's plenty of examples of that. But a person who finds their rest in God has the resilience his spirit needs, or her spirit needs. The getaway isn't the source of the well-being. The source of the flourishing is the actual presence of God. Staying in the presence of God, living in the presence of God, just like the old hymn says, "'Tis so sweet." This is just from Jesus simply taking life and rest and joy and peace. I highly recommend Brother Lawrence's book, The Practice of the Presence of God. He lived in that space, and his testimony is very strong. And with that, I'm going to call it a day. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.